I would first like to express my gratitude for being invited to this Congress, BANTAO, 18th BANTAO Congress. Plus, I'm very happy to be in this beautiful city of Thessaloniki. In the next few minutes, it will be more than a scientific presentation, a more humanitarian and perhaps organizational presentation. And I hope I will be able to convince you that the Renal Disaster Relief Task Force actually can do a lot during times of disasters. So disasters actually are defined by the WHO as serious disruptions of the functioning of a society, causing widespread human, material, economic, and environmental losses. So these can be natural disasters, geophysical, climate-associated, earthquakes that we live through in this area, in Balkan area, as well as Turkey, of course. Also biologic epidemics that we recently had, COVID pandemia, but also, unfortunately, there are man-made disasters, pollution, industrial disasters, fires, nuclear accidents, and also wars and armed conflicts, one which we are actually every day seeing from the television, from the news, and unfortunately affects our patients as well. Now, when we look at the spectrum of medical problems during disasters, in fact, there are many. So it's not only kidney problems, obviously. You would be surprised to know that medical disorders, including acute myocardial infarction, stroke, obstetrical problems, preterm deliveries, peptic ulcer bleedings, respiratory system problems, seizures even, many infections, post-traumatic stress disorders, or other psychiatric disorders, all the incidences increase during the times of disasters. Admission of these patients during times of disasters to the hospitals have been demonstrated to increase. So it is not the actual disaster-related problems. However, in addition, of course, these unrelated type of disasters add on to the victims of the disasters who also present to the hospitals very frequently. So obviously, depending on the time of disasters, on the type of disasters, as you can see, the actual reasons can change. So mainly crash syndromes can occur after earthquakes as well as during armed conflicts. But tsunamis, floods, nuclear war accidents all affect our patients in different ways. So if we concentrate on the nephrological problems at times of disasters, crash syndrome has been well recognized, especially during earthquakes and also any armed conflict that causes destruction, collapse of a building through bombing, etc., and people being stuck under the rubble. And also, of course, AKI due to other reasons at times of disasters. But in addition to this acute problem, we also have to think about the organization of our patients on renal replacement therapy, hemodialysis, peritoneal dialysis, as well as renal transplant patients who may not have access to their immunosuppressive medications. These two groups actually comprise most of the vulnerable population at times of disasters. However, of course, management of patients with chronic conditions, including chronic kidney disease patients, diabetes patients, hypertension, other patients with glomerular disease who are on immunosuppressive treatment also have difficulty in accessing their medications. Now, I will spend a little bit more time on crash syndrome since it comprises a lot of the situation. Crash syndrome was first actually described by Professor Eric Bywaters after the, which is called the Blitz, during the Second World War due to the bombing of London. And more than 40,000 civils died. And Eric Bywaters published first in the British Medical Journal about the crash injuries. He actually described 4 cases of crash syndrome, with 3 were oliguric, dark-colored urine, and unfortunately all died. And he concluded, based on these 4 cases, that kidney failure caused by crash syndrome frequently result in death. Later, in 1988, there was a big Armenian earthquake. And this was the first time that the nephrology community's attention was drawn to renal disaster concept. In fact, during the Armenian earthquake, I will try to go back a little. During the Armenian earthquake, about 600 patients with acute kidney injury who had crush injuries, 200 were sent to Moscow because dialysis was not readily available. So many died. And this was why it was called a renal disaster. So it's not a heart disaster, it's not a liver disaster, but it's a kidney disaster for this reason. In fact, after the earthquakes, 80% of the victims die immediately on the spot due to a major injury. So unfortunately, as nephrologists, there's not much that we can do for these patients. Then about 10% have only minor injury. Whether they go to the hospital or not, they recover. Then the 10% which actually dies due to crash syndrome is very important. So after acute death due to major trauma, the most common second cause of death at times of these disasters is crash syndrome. So that's why we think the renal disaster term really merits its place. Now, again, for the Renal Disaster Task Force, immediately after this Armenian earthquake, unfortunately, no organized international support and structure was available. And then the ISN started Renal Disaster Relief Task Force. This was the first time that the name actually came up. And it was Norbert Lemaire and his colleagues who started this. And yesterday we listened to Dr. Raymond Van Holder, who succeeded afterwards after Dr. Norbert Lemaire. Now, concentrating to the Balkan region, this is the European Seismic Hazard Map. And you can see, and I will enlarge our region, you can see that the Balkan region is one of the most hazardous geographical situation from seismic point of view. And in fact, most of us here have been through various earthquakes since in all these Balkan countries, there has been many earthquakes through history. So, and as you can see here, Turkey, unfortunately, has many faults. In 1999, we had the breaking of this North Anatolian or Black Sea region break of the fault. And we had a very intensive earthquake. Now, after this earthquake, there were some lessons that we learned. And it was, again, ISN's Renal Disaster Task Force who reached out to Turkey, and we were very grateful for them. Mehmet Sever, who is also, I would say, my mentor in this field, then published the lessons learned from the Marmara earthquake, and this is also available in English. So the main lessons was that about 2 to 5% of all crash syndrome victims rescued from under the rubble at times of earthquakes, crash syndrome was seen. And about 50 to 75% of these patients need hemodialysis. So we must actually imagine that we have at one thousands of patients arriving, and then about 2 to 5% of this sum actually develops crush syndrome, and again 50 to 75% of this will need dialysis. So this needs preparedness and organization. Rescue operations should actually continue for at least 2 weeks, because there were alive people and people that can be saved, that can live, who are rescued from under the rubble within that period. Fasciotomies were a big problem, and they should be made with the right indications, so we also need to cooperate with our orthopedic surgical friends and general surgical friends. Otherwise, infections were inevitable, and very often people who are rescued from under the rubble alive can die due to sepsis during their stay at the hospital. Amputation is another problem. You may think that what does amputation to do with the nephrology? But we are generally the people who are following these patients with crush syndrome, and very often these amputations again should be made with precision and with the right indications. Organization before the disaster occurs is the key to mitigate these effects. Now, very briefly, of all injured, 2 to 5%, and of all rhabdomyolysis, 30 to 50% develop crush injuries, crush syndrome. They have both surgical and medical findings. And among the medical findings is hyperkalemia and acidosis, which we all know kill the patient. Now, and most of these patients, therefore, to save them from death from hyperkalemia and acidosis, need hemodialysis. So conservative treatment for these patients are only bridging the time period until we have organized for the patient to receive dialysis. Now, the victim rescued from under the rubble can rapidly deteriorate and die, and this we call rescue death. And this is because of severe metabolic acidosis and hyperkalemia. Unfortunately, this occurs. Therefore, one of our, perhaps, all nephrologists are familiar with these complications, but one of our missions is to teach both the medical students as well as the people in the emergency departments working casualties, working in rescue operations, about these risks and how to treat them. In fact, in Turkey, after the Marmara earthquake, we have included in our curriculum for the medical students a special section in AKI for the treatment and management of crush syndrome. Is it possible to prevent the crush syndrome? Yes, indeed it is. And it has been very well demonstrated in one of the other earthquakes that happened in Turkey by some of our colleagues, that aggressive fluid resuscitation should be started during the rescue efforts, and early and intensive fluid treatment can actually prevent AKI. So this is a message that we should give to our medical colleagues. Indeed, this is what we teach. As soon as an extremity is visible, putting an IV line and starting treating the patient will actually save the patient's life. Another thing that we need to especially tell to other colleagues than nephrologists perhaps is to make sure that the IV fluids that we're administering are not balanced electrolyte solutions. They should not be containing even trace amounts of potassium. You would be surprised to see that a certain percentage of patients victims being brought to the hospital have actually IV lines and fluids having potassium in them, which is iatrogenically a medical malpractice, really. So all these things we have to be teaching to our medical students as well as other colleagues. So, of course, nephrologist's job is never finished, so it is not only about the crush syndrome. Authorities generally concentrate during mass disasters, obviously, on the general population. So they are concentrate on housing, shelter, food, sanitation, prevention of epidemia, rescue operations, transportation, as well as safety issues. Of course, all these are very, very important. I mean, nobody can say no. But then, what about the patients with chronic diseases and with special needs? They comprise the most vulnerable proportion because their needs are overlooked. So, as nephrologists, as the nephrology community, we should be advocating for their needs, for them, and with them. And amongst these, of course, as well as oncology patients, diabetes patients, there are chronic kidney disease patients and patients who are on renal replacement therapy. Now, disasters are especially challenging for the organization of renal replacement therapy. For patients on hemodialysis, access to dialysis centers may not be possible. Dialysis staff themselves may be victims of the earthquake and may not be able to work. Access to medications may be impaired. Dialysis centers actually may be unable to operate, as has occurred during the earthquakes in Turkey. And patients may be on dialysis actually at the time of disasters. So all these are different concerns. For patients on PD, again, access to solutions may not be possible. APD cannot be used due to power supplies. This has also occurred in Ukraine, for example, during the armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Again, hygienic environment may not be available. And then for kidney transplant patients, availability and access to immunosuppressive medications may be an important problem, and it has been, both, as I will soon say, both again in Ukraine and also in the civil war of Sudan, and now the same problem, the same risk is faced in Israel-Palestine conflict among these patients. So, I have already shown you that Turkey is an earthquake country, and we had this recent earthquake in the southeastern Turkey in February 2023. As you can see, it was a massive disaster. The roads were disrupted as well. So, what could we do? Now, from the lessons that we took in 1999, since 1999, we have a renal disaster relief task force in Turkey. This doesn't mean that these people who are members of the task force actually go to the rescue operations. So this isn't something feasible and not something recommended either. However, as you can see, we have divided Turkey into 17 regions, and each region has one or more coordinators. They are all local nephrologists. And here you can see with the yellow highlighted people who were actually the coordinators of the earthquake region in February 2023. They immediately contacted their nephrologist colleagues, other nephrologist colleagues in the area, and with that, we could actually immediately have a network and learn about the situation, what they need, and actually directly be involved in supporting our colleagues. What does a local renal disaster task force do? national societies, when I say local, national societies, renal disaster task force do? Well, in the disaster-free period, we perform educational activities, health staff and rescue teams about how to treat people to prevent AKI. Organization of dialysis is also important. That requires, again, a preparedness between the dialysis centers. We also educate patients how to survive when dialysis is not available, what to eat, how to avoid potassium at times when they do not have access to dialysis, or how to restrict their fluid intake during that time. Medications should be within easy reach that they can grab and go. And how to detach themselves, very important, from the dialysis at the time when an earthquake occurs, if they are on the dialysis. And again, planning of the services is amongst our task description at times that are disaster-free. Then immediately at the disaster period, we have a rapid communication within the task force. We receive information about the extent of damage, regular updates through local coordinates. In the last earthquake, for example, we had daily Zoom meetings every evening with the local coordinators and replanned every day. We define the needs, what supplies they need. Do they need extra dialyzers, extra catheters, for example, how that can be delivered? I can say you that we were actually quicker than the health authorities, because health authorities need to take care of everything. And they really appreciate when there's a group of people actually dedicated to only kidney patients and provision of dialysis. Again, in the recovery phase, every disaster has a recovery phase, reassessing the needs, defining what we could improve. Assessing the damage losses and analyzing the data are very important for the lessons to be taken that may at least be helpful in the future disasters. So these were some of the dialysis centers in the area during the earthquakes. So obviously, you know, the patients, the chronic dialysis patients who were actually normally being taken to receiving dialysis there could not. So we needed to coordinate these patients to other dialysis units immediately. And all this was a task of our National Renal Disaster Relief Task Force. So major points of planning during the last earthquake, obviously, you know, estimating the possible number of crash injuries, transfer of patients on chronic dialysis at the big university or state hospitals to satellite units, so that we could actually have space for the arriving victims and we could provide dialysis to more AKI patients. We also had to organize the shifts for nurses and doctors. Doctors and nurses working in the area of earthquake are also victims of the earthquake, and they are burnout, and they are torn actually between their family, their children whom they want to be with, they want to protect, and then their duties. So we actually had a list of volunteers, and we rotated, weekly rotation with the young nephrologists, nurses, dialysis technicians to the area to support our colleagues in the area. So obviously, and unfortunately, armed conflicts are somewhat different. In natural disasters, the main one in this area seems to be the earthquakes, have a time limit. So it occurs, like in a week or so, a recovery phase starts. Wherever in armed conflicts, unfortunately, these are man-made disasters, and unfortunately, it becomes chronic. So it's very difficult to manage the patients in these situations. In Ukraine, there were many dialysis patients. The acute cases actually in Ukraine were in the border area and were managed by the hospitals there. We did not have much information for that. But there were about more than 700 patients, chronic dialysis patients, who were distributed within Europe. And then, of course, Sudan. There was a civil war in Sudan. Maybe you have heard from the news in April 2023, very recently. Again, ISN had a renal disaster relief task force. We had virtual meetings with our colleagues from Sudan and tried to work out how we could help. Obviously, supporting during the times of war is far more difficult than a natural disaster. Now, so how can an international renal disaster relief task force be helpful? Again, supporting for supplies, so we get information about on what they need, and then we try to organize through the network in Europe and in the world, to organize delivery of these needed materials. And we update the needed, and to catalyze the communication between certain NGOs who are on the field, like, for example, Doctors Without Borders, or Direct Relief has been a great partner during the crisis in Ukraine and Sudan. And now, unfortunately, the Palestine and Israel conflict, and every day we hear on the news the bombings, and I don't know how many people will have crash syndrome they are trying to rescue. So, to conclude, nowhere in the world, unfortunately, is free from disasters. Patients with kidney diseases are among the most vulnerable, and preparedness is the key to mitigate the effects of disasters. Therefore, renal disaster task forces may have an important role in preparedness for disasters and from organizational aspects at the times of disasters. So I hope I could convince you to have local, the importance of having local renal disaster task forces as part of preparedness. In very unfortunate, but they happen anyway for future disasters. So thank you very much for your attention.